Well, thank you all for taking time to chat. Glenn, nice to meet you. So I figured it'd be helpful just to give a little bit of background on BloomBoard and sort of our work, and then more broadly across the country, and then talk very specifically about some of the OPSRC partnership that we're super excited about in launching here. So we've been around for about 2010. Quick introduction. So I'm Jason Lang. I'm the founder, president for BloomBoard. I lead a lot of our state level work, a lot of the policy work. We have a couple other members of the team on the call here as well that support Oklahoma and a bunch of our sort of work in the South as well. So a quick background on us. We've been around since 2010, really done lots of state level work, lots of sort of large scale, sort of district level partnerships across many, many states. We've been really fortunate. We're about as mission driven as you can get from a company standpoint. We've been very fortunate to have several big foundations actually as investors in the company. So the Gates Foundation, the Dell Foundation, the Emerson Collective, Steve Jobs Family Office are all investors in the company, and Learn Capital as well. And then we've had some really amazing luminaries over the years help support all of our sort of journey, including Joanne Weiss, who is Arnie Duncan's chief of staff, Tom Vander Ark, who Bill Gates tapped to start the education work at the Gates Foundation, on our board for a long time. But anyway, so we've been super excited and fortunate to have a bunch of really helpful sort of guides in this whole journey, and really have spent the last 5 years really focused on how to help districts and states and policymakers think about this shift away from seat time-based learning and sort of traditional degree sort of credit hour models, where we really are just tracking attendance, for lack of a better term. We're sort of plugging people into stuff and hoping they get inspired and hoping they can then take that learning, take that content back to their classrooms and actually change their practice. And we know that that's actually a really hard thing to do, and so it often doesn't happen, and so the existing system just doesn't realize as much change in practice as we'd like. And so we're seeing that whole system start to move towards a very competency-based system, and thinking about how certification and career advancement changes when all of a sudden demonstration becomes the bar for that sort of process. And so we've really been working with and trying to build out an entire ecosystem around that, where we can maintain really high quality and rigor, and at the same time have a bunch of really amazing partners in the process, like OPSRC, to help advance that cause across the country. And so we've been really excited about the work here. We've obviously have other partners like AIR, National Board Certified Teacher Network, and sort of helped build out some pre-candidacy work. And then a lot of state departments, a lot of other partners are really building out very specific endorsement areas around ESL and special education and other areas that we'll talk about in a second here. So that's sort of the quick overview of our work. We always find it helpful just to sort of give you some context for the broader lines. I actually need to update Oklahoma here now on my new slide. But the real sort of quick overview from our national work is we've done a bunch of different work in probably 4 or 5 different buckets. The first big bucket is really sort of new teacher induction programs. So a lot of what we've been working with states on is taking that 3-inch binder of paper that teachers used to submit in May and get feedback on 10 months later in red pen, which isn't definitely super helpful for them in their craft, and taking that and replacing that binder with a set of 9 micro-credentials based on new teacher centers work around core induction competencies. And so we've built out those micro-credentials, and now we work with the service centers and different support organizations to then embed those in their mentorship process. And so as a teacher's working on something like maximizing learning through classroom routines as one of those competencies, one of those micro-credentials, that teacher, instead of putting paper in a binder, they're actually videotaping their classroom. They're showing how they've actually demonstrated really strong routines in their practice. They're getting feedback from their coaches and facilitators in the process. And ultimately, they're submitting that entire portfolio, the video and their lesson plans and their student work, and showing that their students have automaticity implementing that routine. And that's actually what earns them the micro-credential, and then earns them sort of completion of that induction program. And so it's really trying to think about that process. Importantly, the feedback process. So if a teacher uploads that portfolio, they'll get feedback within 3 to 5 days. And so it's really interesting in terms of how to think about the way to actually create a much more sort of responsive feedback system. And so we've done a lot of different induction work in Kansas and in Delaware, and really starting to build out broader sort of career advancement pipelines. So Arkansas actually has now a 4-tier licensure system that goes all the way from new teacher induction to professional educator to teacher leadership and master teacher pathways. And so we're working with the state to build out micro-credential pathways to manage that entire career continuum. And so in the future, you'll be able to navigate your entire licensure career in Arkansas totally based on competency, totally based on micro-credentials, which is a really interesting shift. The second big bucket tends to be around sort of these one-off endorsements. So not surprisingly, especially in areas that are sort of new from an endorsement standpoint, like computer science, many states have started to look at, are there ways that you can use micro-credentials to create a better, faster, more effective, more efficient sort of certification structure for STEM and computer science pathways. And so in the state of Rhode Island, we actually are the state's computer science endorsement. And so you can go to code.org's training, you can go to University of Rhode Island's training, you can go to your in-service day. All of those are great places to learn about the actual what good in computer science instruction looks like. But in order to actually earn that endorsement, you've got to earn these 6 micro-credentials that are built on the Computer Science Teachers Association's CS framework. And so we've worked with the state. We also have a new contract with the state of Arizona, where we're rolling out a K-8 computer science endorsement as well, specific to computational thinking in elementary schools and what that looks like. And then ultimately, we've done this same sort of process with financial literacy and STEM endorsements. In Alabama, we're really starting to push towards with gifted and talented ESL, special education endorsements, and then really starting to move into some interesting places in Texas and Wisconsin, where they're looking at competency-based salary advancement, salary schedules. So taking the existing plus 30, plus 15, and changing that into, or making it equivalent with micro-credentials. And so if you earn those 15 micro-credentials, if you earn those 30 micro-credentials, you get the same lane change, but you're doing so in a very competency-based structure that's specific to your district goals. Texas is actually a pretty interesting model in that they have a new piece of legislation that passed last summer called HB 2424 that allows micro-credential pathways for all programs of study related to licensure. And so we're starting to work with the state to really figure out exactly what their future of their ESL certification, their bilingual certification might look like. And I'll share some of that in a second here as well. And then in Connecticut, also working on some ESL, some diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and then more computer science, culture responsive instruction in Wisconsin, and some more SEL in Indiana. And so that's sort of the one-off endorsement category. The third big category tends to be CTE, and this has gotten us into, so in the state of Minnesota, we actually are a statewide CTE alt cert pathway. So if you think about all of your teachers going through construction careers, work-based learning endorsements, medical careers, transportation careers, we've then partnered with the service centers to provide a competency-based structure for that endorsement that can be offered statewide. And so a teacher doesn't have to drive 4 hours to the one university in the state that offers that certification. They can now go to their local service center and get that endorsement and do so in a way that's actually very job embedded. And that has started us moving into all sorts of really interesting workforce development pathways. And we have a partnership with the Urban Institute through a Department of Labor grant that's actually based on micro-credentialing the registered apprenticeship program. And so we're really starting to get into some high school student micro-credentialings for what good employability skills look like. And there's lots of other work in Florida that's sort of starting to move down that pathway. And then the last big bucket tends to be leadership. And so where we've done a lot of work across teacher leadership and leadership for equity. So in Illinois, there's a principal's designation for a leadership for equity designation that can go on a principal's license that we've built out with a bunch of sort of thought leaders in the state of Illinois. And then Louisiana is probably one of the more progressive states in terms of policy, and that they, about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, actually passed and replaced all teacher leader licensure with micro-credentials. And so if you no longer take a multiple choice test to earn your mentorship license, your mentor license, you actually have to earn a set of micro-credentials, and that's the way you become a mentor, which is required by law for anybody working with student teachers. And so we've been working with the state to build out that entire process. And then we have a new partnership we're working on with AASA, the National Superintendents Association, to think about sort of the superintendent's endorsement and micro-credentialing structure for leaders. Any questions there more broadly? We can probably just come back to this in Q&A, but that just sort of gives you a sense of the broad context. The next part here I'll try and go through pretty quickly, just given time. Really fundamentally, when we sort of think about our work, we have evolved quite a bit over the last 10 years, but fundamentally at the core of everything we do has always been this thesis, which is we know that teachers are the #1 driver of outcomes for kids. And therefore, I joke with our team, we'll do anything that really starts to drive this process and drive sort of better instruction. And so that means tomorrow, if tomorrow all of a sudden we realize you could plug people into virtual reality goggles and create the best teachers ever, we would start manufacturing and building towards sort of virtual reality if that we thought that was going to be at the best service of kids. And so what that means is that we've been able to do quite a lot over the years in terms of really trying to figure out this entire system. And in the early days, we were doing a lot of work around observation evaluation. So all of the race to the top observation evaluation systems, data collection systems, we built those for states and tried to use this thesis that we just don't have data about what teachers are doing. And so if we had better ways to collect data, we could give them better feedback. I think fairly quickly we realized that there's a lot of perverse incentives in the observation world. And frankly, it's really hard to actually find ways to overcome that. And so almost all teachers have actually just been rated effective, and student data didn't really move. And so unfortunately, that was a big waste of money and time, because we just couldn't get over the fact that principals don't have a reason to give really hard, meaningful feedback to teachers in any really meaningful way. And so that really wasn't going to change and move the needle. And so we moved away from the evaluation world, and we actually got into the personalized learning sort of space, where we were trying to figure out what would good personalized educator support look like. And we actually built the first Amazon marketplace for PD and started aggregating hundreds of different PD providers and aggregating content. And then fairly quickly realized that the problem of what we were serving up across these hundreds of different PD providers is that almost all of the content was sit and get. And that at the end of the day, we now have a bunch of research. So this is a research that called the Joyce and Showers data that's been replicated many, many times over now. And what they started to realize when they started to dig into teacher training was there's really two factors you're trying to influence when you're thinking about teacher development. Really, it's sort of personal understanding and mastery. Do I understand why guided reading is a really important skill for early literacy? And the second process is then you're trying to transfer that understanding, that new knowledge, to your practice. And so if I take all my teachers down to the cafeteria or to the library, and I actually sort of just give them a lecture about research and theory on a set of competencies or on a set of skills, not surprisingly, I don't change either, right? They don't get much out of that, and they don't change anything in their practice. If I actually then model for them and show them, here's a guided reading lesson, here's what this looks like, I can start to change their understanding a little bit, and that they'll understand sort of what that looks like. But again, I'm not going to change their practice much. And then if I actually force them to role play, this is sort of the reason behind I do, we do, you do, right? If I actually now give you the theory, give you the actual model, and then say, okay, now we're going to role play. Let me actually have you practice in small groups around your tables. Let me actually have you try this out. Now I can really start to bridge the gap into their own personal understanding. But at the end of the day, the most likely scenario is that those teachers are going to leave that in-service day, that they're going to leave that session, and they're going to go back to their classrooms, and they're going to do exactly the same thing they did the day before. Because, you know, human beings are creatures of habits, and we all suffer the same process. Change is hard. And so unless we actually are able to really sort of figure out how to change this problem, we're not really going to change practice. And what the research has now shown is that the only way we really know how to fundamentally change classroom practice in a really meaningful, reliable way is by actually dipping into the classrooms of teachers and giving them some sort of coaching, mentoring, feedback on their actual craft based on their actual practice. And that this is really hard to do right now because, right, we know mentoring doesn't really scale. It's almost impossible to get a mentor into every school in the country. And so if we can't get mentors into every classroom, or we can't get coaches into every classroom, their next best option is to actually use technology to do this. And so part of the idea behind the micro-credential structure is to say, well, what if we could flip this model? And what if we could give all the same artifacts that a coach would really be interested in looking for in terms of the lesson plans and the actual video of the actual instruction and the actual student data, student sort of output. And if we could aggregate all that data and all those artifacts, we could then have a third-party coach review that and provide the same coaching and mentoring and feedback on that teacher's practice. And we could get almost to the same level of change in practice because we're still using technology to do the same sort of, mimic the same sort of process. And that's really the fundamental structure behind what a micro-credential or what this competency-based approach is trying to do, is trying to give teachers real-time feedback or as close to real-time as possible on their actual practice in their actual classrooms with their actual kids, because we know that that changes practice. The flip side of this, and what's really interesting, is the moment you start to then ask people to build those portfolios, there's a whole new set of research that's come out in the last 5 years that has shown that portfolio-based learning as a model, as a modality, actually has really powerful increases in actual learning outcomes. And so this is the movement, this is a lot of the research behind the competency-based learning movement for students. So Carnegie Mellon put out this report called Learning is Not a Spectator Sport. And what they showed is if you take thousands of people in a lecture environment and have a subset of them actually have to go through and build the portfolio of work rather than just go through the actual lecture and click through all the quizzes. But the folks who had to go through and build the portfolio, they got 6 times the learning and retention. And the crazy part is that they were able to do it in half the time investment in the content itself. So had they just watched all the videos and gone through all the quizzes. And that is a really powerful change in sort of return on time. And right now, today, teachers submit across the entire country teachers submit about 100 million hours of time annually for PD related purposes. Obviously pre-COVID, since nobody does PD at this point anymore, given we can't get together. But if we think about sort of the old world we used to live in, right, teachers are submitting tens of millions, 100 million hours of time annually. And so our big epiphany was, well, imagine if we could give teachers back 50 million hours of time to spend with their kids, give them half that time back, and get 6 times the change in practice. And if we could do that, fundamentally, we would just have a different education system. And so that's really been the sort of the crux. So not only does this idea of competency-based learning actually provide more targeted feedback to teachers, which helps them change their practice, because it's giving them feedback on their craft in their classrooms, but it also gives them a better path to learning more and retaining more in the process. And that is ultimately what led us to this idea of what does the future of competency-based support look like for teachers, and how do we really shape that in terms of a way that can change instruction and change pathways. And so really that's what the micro-credential sort of became. And then, so the quick overview for those of you not familiar with micro-credentials is they're really not a course. So people call them courses, modules, but they're not a course. There's no time component to it. There's not really sort of an actual sort of set of travel requirements, right? You don't have to go anywhere. There's no sort of in-person component, and it's not your traditional sort of test or sort of exam. Really, the best way I can sort of describe and sort of think about what a micro-credential is it's almost like the way you got your driver's license, which is you went and did a bunch, you learned a bunch about sort of driving and sort of all the rules of the road, and then you went to an actual place where someone got in your car, your actual sort of vehicle. They sat in the passenger seat, and then they watched you drive and rated you on a rubric while you did the work and actually showed that you could demonstrate competency in that skill. And then they rated you on the rubric and went down the checklist. And they said, yep, nice work. Or they said, nope, you got to come back next week and next month and you got to redo your parallel parking. And that is, in its most simplistic form, that is what a micro-credential is. And that doing that in person obviously doesn't scale very well. And so what we're asking is teachers to upload all of those artifacts, and that we're having that third-party review, that third-party person do that review in that portfolio. Or it's sort of like a similar, like a very discrete, specific skill version of national board certification, if any of you are familiar with that process. And so what we've done is we took that micro-credential process, and then we realized there were lots of ways we could take that process and embed a lot of the best PD research about what is the most effective ways to improve teacher quality and teacher practice. And so we started to embed that in the overall process for micro-credentialing. So the first one we realized was the best opportunities are if we can make this use a cycle of inquiry approach in the micro-credential process. So there's lots of good research, call it action research, call it cycle of inquiry, call it plan, do, reflect. Whatever your cycle moniker is, what we've realized is if you can embed a cycle of inquiry so that the teacher is analyzing research about a specific problem of practice, they're then implementing that practice, then they're reflecting on that practice, that cycle is really, really powerful. And so we wanted to make sure that was part of the process. We then also wanted to make sure that there's a really clear set of job embedded supports. So we know collaboration and PLCs and mentorship at the local level, at the school level, at the district level are really important. And so if we try to make micro-credentials just a thing that you do on your own as a teacher, it's not going to be as successful as if we actually embed it in the district culture and in the district learning systems. And so we actually spend a lot of time working at the district level to embed those job embedded supports. And then ultimately we do a lot of work. Obviously we covered the portfolio-based learning research in terms of that side of it. And then the last piece is we realized fairly quickly that we have to have really rigorous and really sort of thoughtful evaluation and sort of assessment systems. You can imagine as a teacher, if I'm going through this process, so now I'm no longer going to and looking for the 6 hours for credit that I'm going to get for PD. I'm no longer just going to go plug into some online module while I'm watching Game of Thrones or binge watching The Office for the third time. So I'm no longer going to go sort of plug in and sort of just click through some modules while I'm watching TV. But instead, I've got to now go videotape myself in my classroom with my kids. I'm not sure how many of you like actually watching yourself on video, but it's a pretty vulnerable experience. And then I've got to videotape myself. I've got to reflect and annotate that video and tell why I'm being deliberate about a certain set of practices. And then I upload that with my lesson plan and my student work. I upload all of it to the black box of the internet where the expert's actually going to rate me on a rubric and potentially tell me that I didn't do that as well as I think or as well as I think I want to be from an instructional standpoint. And that is a really vulnerable experience. And so you can imagine that anything that goes wrong with that review process all of a sudden has a much, much higher level of scrutiny behind it. So we need to make sure that we have really timely. So this is the reason we guarantee a 5-day turnaround time for reviews, is because if you don't get feedback immediately, you start to lose the opportunity to iterate on that feedback. And so we want to make sure we're super responsive there. We maintain a really high level of inter-rater reliability. We work out sort of 2 reviewers review every single submission that happens in the process, and then we try to maintain an 80% inter-rater reliability threshold, which is statistically perfect in that process. And so we're spending lots of time trying to build out very strong, sophisticated, rigorous assessment so that teachers can rely and districts can rely on that feedback in a really coherent way to make sure that it's actually meeting the actual vulnerability factor at the same level. And so that, once you've gone through those sort of core supports, really what that looks like is this idea that if, let's say I'm going through this classroom routines micro-credential in a system, what actually happens is the teacher is going to then analyze their current practice. We can do this with leaders as well. The teacher basically analyzes their current practice against the research that exists, and then they upload that analysis. Then they're going to design and or develop the actual artifacts associated with that work. And so they're going to upload the lesson plans and whatever, so the exit tickets, whatever they've built to implement that actual research based on the analysis. And then they're going to implement. And so in this case, they're actually going to capture, here are 2 to 3 videos showing automaticity with routines that my students can go through and showing exactly how they implemented that and why those are strong routines that actually help maximize student learning. And they capture that video, they upload that video and the annotations associated with it. And then ultimately they evaluate, did it work? Why not? As a good reflective practice exercise, right? This idea of sort of personal growth is often connected to your ability to be reflective around what you're doing and why. And so all of that then gets uploaded into the system, and that then drives, right, what the reviewer then within, again, 3 to 5 days, what that reviewer's feedback is on what they're trying to go through in that process. And it says, yep, either you earned it, or nope, here's some things you can improve on. Here's what you need to do to resubmit. And ultimately that process then tends to look something like this when we embed it inside of a district structure, which is, we'll typically cohort teachers around specific, schools or specific grade teams, whatever the case may be. We'll kick off that actual sort of micro-credential, go through those job embedded supports, the PLC structures, mentorship, whatever it is. While teachers are building that portfolio, they're going through that cycle of inquiry model, and then they submit, and again, they get really rigorous feedback within 3 to 5 days. And ultimately, that's really what the process looks like to go through the actual ultimate work. And so once we launch this, as you can imagine, this is a really different process than saying, well, here's an online course catalog. And so when we launched this process, initially, no one really did it. And this is obviously, we learned quite a bit in the early days as we were going through this. But what we most fundamentally realized is that this is a really vulnerable process, sort of what we were talking about earlier. And if there's no real incentive to do it, no one's going to do it, right? It may actually make you a better teacher. And I think we're sort of building out, we've got 12 federal research grants that we're building out a pretty amazing set of research data that shows we can actually change practice definitively. And ultimately, we believe we'll be able to show that we can change student outcomes and improve student outcomes. But the fundamental question is, that's a really high bar in terms of this vulnerability factor. And so if all I'm trying to get is my PD credit, I'm not going to go do that, because I can get my PD credit in much, much easier ways. And so what we started to realize is that unless we actually had a commensurate incentive structure in place, we just weren't ever going to be able to see this sort of engagement that we really wanted that was going to change outcomes for kids. And when we started to talk to districts, what we realized fairly quickly is that there are some very big incentive structures in place in districts. They all just happen to look like big Excel spreadsheets and salary schedules. And that most of the time, the plus 15, the master's degrees, most of the salary schedules that exist in most states are actually tied to fairly expensive graduate credit that often costs, $400, $600 per credit hour. And so you're talking about $1,500 per class, right? $1,800 per class that a teacher would take for those 3 credits. And that most of the time, those credits aren't grounded in actually any sort of actual current practice. It's a lot of theory. I have a master's in education, and taking history of the AP is interesting. It wasn't going to make me a better AP teacher. And so it's just not sort of grounded in the actual sort of current demonstration of work. And it requires a ton of outside time, that sort of nights and weekends. And so it's really sort of overwhelming in that process. And it's really not grounded in actual competence. And so what we're finding is that in many districts across the country, it's really sort of astronomical. Upwards of 20 to 40% of all teachers across almost all districts are actually maxed out before some large out-of-pocket cost degree-bearing lane change. And that is really the fundamental crux and crisis behind a lot of the teacher talent the teacher shortage crisis we're in right now, is that every month, every 6 months, every year, large percentage of teachers are actually going to look up and say, well, and it's now the time that I can make a jump and make more elsewhere, because it doesn't make sense for me to pay 15, 20 grand to get a master's degree where I'm going to make another $1,000, another $1,500 in my actual pay. And that crux in it, if you add licensure to that mix, now all of a sudden we have some really interesting potential incentives, which is where we then started to move into this idea of, well, what if we didn't just do competency-based professional development, but what if we really focused on competency-based career advancement? And if we could attach licensure and career advancement and lane change to competency, all of a sudden we would be able to meet the actual incentive structures that would make a ton of sense. And that is really this idea that what if we could create a place where districts had the ability to change their approach for professional development, and at the same time marry that with their approach for career advancement. So we'd be taking and replacing a system of professional development that's based on hours and making a system that's based on competency, and at the same time creating a system for advancement that moves teachers up their salary schedule much cheaper than the alternatives, but is also really grounded in the district's goals. And that whole idea, this idea of a competency-based approach to compensation and advancement using these micro-credentials, is really what we've seen many states, many districts just get really excited about, because it just changes the paradigm. And ultimately that tends to look like, so we have a bunch of different partners in different service centers, different districts across the country, different association bodies, where really what we're starting to do is build out these sort of graduate degree equivalency programs. And so it's starting to think about, as a district leader, what if you had the ability to make that plus 15, that plus 30 in your lane change, but customize some part of that. So in this case, this is still 30 micro-credentials, which is 30 credits. Every micro-credential is equivalent to a single university credit. And so this is still the same 30 credit hours by size, but now as a district leader, I'm actually able to really customize this foundation's micro-endorsement, as we call it, to my strategic plan. And so I know very specifically, how do I want to make sure, if we're working on a one-to-one initiative, we're working on early literacy, if we're trying to improve our test data, what am I trying to do, and how do I make sure that every teacher is at the right baseline in the core competencies that matter based on my strategic plan? And then at the same time, how can I open up flexibility and personalization for teachers so that they can do and work on the things that they're most excited about, and at the same time, ideally work on things that are aligned to their licensure pathways. And this is where now we've started to build out and work with states and different departments of education to then build things like computer science and computational thinking sort of endorsements. And the idea is that this is the same set of micro-credentials that actually are the state's computer science endorsement in Rhode Island, same ones we're working on in Arizona. Obviously with the new Oklahoma legislation around computer science, this is sort of a similar path that we're trying to look at there. But the idea is we're now giving teachers flexibility to not only embed their licensure pathway into their advancement pathway, but it's sort of also a cheaper option across the board. So districts might pay for some part of this, teachers pay for some parts of it because it's advancement and salary related, and they get a much cheaper process for advancement that's really tightly aligned and actually driving better outcomes in their work. And so we have some districts in the country where we have massive, large wait lists of teachers trying to get in the program, but ultimately those teachers are not only working on things aligned to the district strategic plan, they're improving their practice because it's a competency-based approach, and they're working towards licensure credit, and they're doing it at a third of the cost of a traditional master's pathway. And they can even finance that third of that cost. We have some finance partners who will let them defer the upfront cost so that they don't have to pay it back effectively until they get their raise. And so it's sort of a 2, 3, 4, 5 birds with one stone approach, which is, I think, what people have gotten really excited about. And that this same sort of process we've then applied to some of the high need areas in Oklahoma. And so thinking about what does a computer science micro-endorsement look like based on the current statute, based on the CS STEM bill that was just passed, what does that look like, and how can we support folks aligned to that the code.org training, aligned in a lot of work that's already happening in the state. Or we've got another one in Texas, we're working on that ESL bilingual endorsement. And so these are the sets of micro-credentials that are focused on that ESL endorsement. And so working through the process, say, well, what would it look like if the ESL endorsement was based on competency in Oklahoma as well? And then the same process, I know one of the big areas we've heard a lot about recently that we've just started to put a bunch of effort into is this whole, what is the future of online instruction? It's pretty clear the fall is going to have some online component to it, and how school rolling closures, how sort of schools respond to what effective online instruction look like is really something that no one was prepared for going into March. And so I think it's one thing to say that teachers can take their existing classroom of kids where they have a bunch of context about their kids and their sort of individual situations, and then they can apply that online. And it's mostly been, using Google Docs or using Google Classroom to just try and put existing instruction online. That is a very different change than when you've got to start new with a new classroom, and that new classroom of kids is all of a sudden starting online. And so really trying to be thoughtful. I think we spent a lot of time working with some pretty amazing experts in terms of the Digital Learning Collaborative, Heather Staker, who wrote the book Blended, lots of really sort of amazing thought leaders in the space to then build out a set of competencies really focused on what does effective online instruction look like, and how do we make sure that you've got the baseline, that every teacher has a baseline about being able to not only build rapport with their kids, but then also think about some of those individualized needs. Are kids healthy? Are they safe? Are they getting fed? Do they have technology? There's a lot of the social emotional sort of world here that we've got to be able to sort of think about. And it's not just online learning. And it's not just, can you use Google Classroom? And so we spent a lot of time making sure that we can build the sort of the most sufficient yet sort of best sort of depth of practice that we think can really move the needle here. And then ultimately guiding people through what are the rules of engagement in an online environment, sort of classroom management plus in the context of what does that look like online? And then how do you think about content? Does the district have sort of pre-packaged content? Are you getting OER resources from your school? Well, how do you sort of embed that content in your instruction and facilitate good active learning around it? And then ultimately, how do you communicate with parents? And we've heard from lots of superintendents that are very concerned with the fact that parents are, getting more and more concerned with the education that's happening within their schools in an online context because, right, it just looks very different, and they're getting the sort of shouldered the burden, and they're not feeling like there's a lot of communication coming from the school about what their kids are doing or where and how. And that's getting more and more frustrating, which is obviously getting elevated to the board level and lots of other sort of questions that come up. And so that's really then started to get into this idea of, can we have then school leaders, right, or leadership teams think about, well, what are the core leadership components to leading in an online sort of blended environment where you're going to have to close school for 14 days. If you have a case pop up, what does that look like, and how do you manage that process, and how do you support teachers and support your communities in that work? And then ultimately, I think the long-term lens is that there is potentially a silver lining in the crisis here, is that this may be an opportunity. I think folks should think about it as an opportunity to start to really think about, can we use this crisis as a way to drive equity and SEL and social emotional learning and even trauma-sensitive instruction in the classrooms? And that these are really the mental health sort of pillars behind, I think, a lot of the problems in online learning, is that it all of a sudden becomes a very agency-driven process, because you've got to hand more control over to students, because they're the ones who are actually sort of on their own trying to figure out the work, either with their parents or not. And so how do you then think about where student agency becomes more elevated? How do you think about equity and cultural responsiveness in that process? How do you think about social emotional learning and motivation and agency in that work? And then ultimately, I think we do need to recognize that a lot of trauma has happened here over the last several months. And how do we think about that? And how do we incorporate that into our actual learning and instruction? And so those are just some of the bigger sort of areas and what we call these things micro endorsements that we've been working on. And again, the idea is, like, we're really starting to focus on what does it look like to actually build and embed these into the actual sort of calendar for districts, so that there's a really clear way so that we can actually support districts in the process as they're trying to get through this transition, really starting probably in early July, knowing that, everybody's going to try and take a pretty big deep breath in June once schools close here, but then post, 4th of July, things are going to kick off in pretty meaningful ways. And that may be one approach, but then again, we've been working on lots of different other ways to think about sort of other different pathways that might make sense, whether it's CTE or STEM or other, sort of different endorsements in the process. And I can share this deck out if people are interested, but I'll just give you a sense of all the different sort of pathways that we work on in the system. So let me pause there, close there. Jason, you can ask any questions or.
Yeah, why don't we open it up to any questions?
One of my questions would be, is the state of Oklahoma recognizing these micro-credentialings on certificates, or do you know?
So we've had a bunch of conversations with the state about what that looks like. I think the current question is sort of where and what that means. So the PD credit side of that is one side. The salary schedule advancement is a whole other sort of issue. And then the licensure component. So the STEM CS bill that was passed is specific to micro-credentials being able to be applied for computer science endorsements and for STEM pathways for licensure. And so in that sense, we definitely have the ability to sort of create a pathway for using this set of computer science micro-credentials as a CS endorsement. And again, I think we could probably do the same thing in these various different STEM pathways. So this is, Louisiana has a STEM pathway for STEM instruction around pre-engineering and around digital emergent media and biomedical sciences. And so as districts are starting to push the envelope into future STEM career sort of course options, right? This may be another place to be able to sort of push on some of that work. But that's often a coordination with both the district saying, yep, I want to include this, or a district saying, yep, I want to use the computer science micro-credentials to have computer science endorsements, and then us just making sure we have formal approval for it.
Thank you.
And Jason, just to clarify one thing on the computer science bill that you mentioned, that bill passed the Senate. It has gone to the House. It is stuck in the House. Given COVID-19, so unfortunately, it doesn't look like it's going to pass this session. It had received really strong support. There's a chance that we could work on getting sort of a 1-year exemption, and while we wait for that legislation to come up again next year. The other piece, Luann, to your question about certification is, there's the standard path of certification, which has historically just been going the traditional higher ed route, right? Bachelor's or master's degree. Districts already do have flexibility, though, to allow someone to pursue certification through professional development. And these micro-credentials could meet those professional development hours. So, a district could adopt that policy. They would need to get that. They would need to submit that plan to the State Department to say, this is what we're going to treat. So if we have emergency certified teachers for them to pursue their alternative certification, it could use these micro-credentials, and that would be a district policy.
Other questions?
Did you get into the cost of this, Jason? Is this the right time?
Oh, sure. So the traditional sort of cost structure, the way we typically sort of have tried to organize this and sort of frame it is really in the same sort of graduate degree credit hour structure. So a traditional graduate credit is, typically $400 to $600 per credit hour. And with each one of these micro-credentials being a single credit hour, a university credit hour in sort of size and equivalency, the cost that we end up sort of using is typically, depends on volume, but typically $200 to $350 per credit hour in that process. So it's often sort of a third to half of the cost of a traditional graduate credit, but it's obviously a very sort of customizable structure to fit into. And again, that cost can be either teacher paid or district paid or some combination thereof based on whatever the incentive structures are in place. And we have lots of work. We've obviously worked with many districts who are embedding this in their salary schedule and giving teachers credit. And so we have lots of the sort of standard language or board approval language you'd need to actually do that equivalency and make that an option for your teachers.
And that to that effect, that's one thing that we've been interested in is as a retention tool. One, we think that this, as Jason explained, can help improve practice, but more importantly, well, maybe not more importantly, but just as importantly, this could help as a retention tool. So if your district adopts this policy to reward teachers that pursue credentials that improve practice, then, the teachers would be more inclined to stay because that may not correspond in other districts' salary incentive pay plans.
Yeah, we definitely see districts use it both for retention because obviously it's sort of like a captive, right? Sort of captive university or captive salary advancement option. The teachers are going to get recognized within their district, but may not get recognized elsewhere. We also see it as an attraction tool. So many districts started to use it and publicize it as a way to show, you can move up your salary schedule much faster in the district at a much cheaper cost because it's very competency based. And that is much more attractive to especially younger teachers who may not want to be teaching for 20, 30 years, but know what they want to make in the next 3, 4, 5 years in terms of helping their families. And so it gives them a real clear option to be able to sort of get there, but do so in a way that's obviously much more helpful for the district in terms of practice. Other questions, comments, concerns?
All right. Well, I think at this time, if anybody has any additional questions or anything, they can reach out to us or reach out to BloomBoard, and we will get in touch and answer any of those questions. We appreciate everybody for being on here, and appreciate BloomBoard, you guys, for coming on and sharing your content. We think that this will be a wonderful opportunity to advance teachers in their careers here in the state of Oklahoma. So thank you guys for that.